Thank you so much, everybody, for showing up for Saving the World Before Breakfast. I know, especially in the Central Time Zone, it's already 8:30. So for Saving the World Before Breakfast, the land alone can save us. If you switch off your video, if you don't want to be recorded, switching on the video will be taken as permission for you to be recorded, and you might you might be famous all over the world on the internet. This is our presentation, starting with a major question. What is the most important thing for survival? And that is food. There's a poem.
Roger, I'm not on.
Oh, you're not on?
No.
Wait a minute, how can you talk if you're not on?
Well,
You don't have a screen?
see me there. I don't see my face.
You should be able to, down in the lower left will be a little camera, and that's what you'd click on.
Oh, start the video.
Yeah, that puts the video on.
Okay.
There you are.
Okay, I'm happy
Excellent.
now.
Okay, we see you. I don't see the other folks, but that's okay. So, the poem from Percy Shelley, and he's talking about something that really fits with history. My name is Ozymandias, king of kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing remains round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare. The lone and level sands stretch away. In the poem, he describes there was a giant statue, and the head had been knocked off, and there was just that little bit of a comment on the foot of the statue where he was a great king and he had a huge statue above it, but everything had turned to desert. And indeed, that's the way much of the ancient world was. All the empires in the Old Testament and when Alexander and the Romans came in the Middle East, those were fertile areas, and they slowly turned to mostly desert, fit mostly just for a few sheep and goats. And the important thing is we need to have food, or else everything falls apart. So the issue's feeding everybody. And that gets a little harder with stopping the new worry because of global warming, which might make it harder to feed everybody. And surprisingly, protecting our farmers from going broke, because when they're doing too good, sometimes the price of food drops down. So they need something else to do to make money in the meantime. And if things get tough, you can always drop that extra stuff to grow more food. So now, hold on to your hats. We're going to get into these things, starting with how I fit in. I wrote a book called Saving the World Before Breakfast, A Better New Green Deal. And I got the idea for that because people in politics were talking about a Green New Deal. They said, we're going to have this global warming unless we do a bunch of things. And so we look at about all the things we might do to fix it. I thought, well, it's good to look at an overall picture. I don't agree with a lot of the specific things. And so said, what would be some better ways to do a fix on those? And that's where I came up with that book. Now, how everybody else fits in, we'll start with, tonight I'm talking about agriculture. The other two major parts of the book were nuclear power and ocean farming and industry. Well, only agriculture is something that can be done, hey, in your backyard. Certainly, farmers are always experimenting with new crops or different ways of doing these things. And of course, eventually, big government. But usually it's the small farmers and research places that come up with things, and eventually government and business follows along and makes it better. So if we're going to save things, agriculture would be the place to start. In fact, agriculture can do it all, I'm going to argue tonight. Now, how you might fit in. First, hopefully you'll enjoy this webinar, learn a few things. might be smarter citizens for voting, telling your neighbors. Of course, my goal is when you comment on things, I might get some ideas. You might have some information for me, and I can say, I can use that. Now, a wondrous few, I'm going to try to recruit, maybe one or two of, is to make some ideas work even better. And everybody at this webinar will get a gift at the end. So the agenda on it is I'll have, we'll talk about the food, climate, and profit problems for about 10 minutes, and then hold your questions for that. But then we'll have another 10 minutes for any questions and discussions. When we get done or run out of time, then we'll go on to the fixes for all those things, the solutions. I've given myself 30 minutes for the dirty soil solutions. Again, more questions, and then I've got to go on with the sales pitch for some of the eager beavers. Most everybody else that doesn't want to do a big time thing could just sit back and have popcorn at that point for a few minutes, and then you'll get your present. Now, talking about as far as the problem, the land has great power. Civilizations rise and fall on they can grow food. Israel was the land of milk and honey, and it was that way for centuries, but then eventually it got poorer and poorer until 1948, when people started rebuilding Israel. It was mostly a desert. Now Rome, they used their soil badly. A lot of it eroded out, filled up their seaports, but they had what was called the Granary of Rome, a country called Libya then and today. And what happened? It's mostly desert today. In the 1930s, North America was busy plowing up and growing a lot of grain in the Midwest, Northern Great Plains, and the Great Plains in general, except some of that land was never meant to have row crops. It shouldn't have been plowed, because when it was dry, things dried up, and a lot of that land traveled all the way past Washington, D.C., and on into the Atlantic Ocean. That was called the Dust Bowl. And it looked like the end of the world to a lot of people that were living there. So everything collapses when farming and ranching collapses. Now the threats, I didn't mention it before. We're going to get another 2 billion people. And that's something. They had the Green Revolution in the 70s when everybody was predicting famines. The Green Revolution stopped that with more food. Well, we need another Green Revolution. We got to feed all those people, despite land is still degrading now. It's eroding by wind, by water, and just nutrients being sucked up by the crops. Global warming, too much global warming, is another worry. And the subversive thought, occasionally it might cool down, which actually could be worse. So along the way, agriculture is part of the worry about global warming, because about a quarter of the carbon dioxide that contributes to global warming is coming from agriculture. When land is plowed and left bare, the soil actually, some of it oxidizes, gives up its carbon, and that goes into the atmosphere. The tractors, the trucks carrying produce in, processing grains and things, they all put up carbon dioxide. And we'll get to the forests, where they're being mismanaged, burn hotter than they would naturally. And those mega fires could contribute to global warming by putting more carbon dioxide up. Along the way, we got to feed more people with high protein, because when people get prosperous, then they want to have more hamburgers. Ronald McDonald did well because people did well. They managed to get business going, and like, hey, I've got a little more money. I'd like a steak, or I'd like some pork. I definitely want two chickens in every pot, to borrow a phrase from the past. Now, we're going back to that issue of degrading land, erosion, decreased soil content. The thing that's been keeping it going is like a drug fix. People put nitrates and phosphorus on the land. Problem with that is that artificial fertilizer is easy to leach out, to blow out, and then it lands somewhere else and causes the streams and the lakes to get too green. It's called eutrophication. It turns to a swamp, and if you get too much algae, too much green in your water, then it sucks the oxygen out when it dies, and then kills all the fish. And that's caused dead zones at the end of the Mississippi River, having at the end of the Amazon. Everywhere you go, too much fertilizer causes too much green and eventually dead zones. Now, another thing is climate, the whole earth isn't getting warmer. There's been some slight warming since the 70s, the worry of 1970s. The worry is that we might have a whole bunch of global warming. And when it happens, the tropics don't change much. The Arctic and Antarctic, the poles might change a lot. And meanwhile, the rainforests will move away from the poles. That'll push grasslands. And that's good for a place like North Africa, Saudi Arabia, India. They have been greener in the past. They'll be greener again. Problem for us is that we have desert below us in North Mexico. And if it gets warmer, that desert can oomph right up into the breadbasket of America. In fact, the Dust Bowl of the 1930s was partly caused by a drought. It was drought combined with bad agricultural practices. But if we got much more global warming, then the drought would be much more severe. In fact, about 6,000 years ago, when there was the warmest period after the glaciers, it got much warmer than we have now. And at that time, West Nebraska was a desert. There's a place called the Sand Hills now with grass and cattle grazing. Well, during that hottest period, the Holocene, those sand hills were sand dunes, just like the Sahara. In fact, they have the same shape as the Sahara dunes today. And then, of course, like I said, could get colder. 1940s to 1975, it got significantly colder. So you never know. Now, as I mentioned, 1/4 of the warming caused by by agriculture. That amount could grow in warmer climate, and bad conditions. Oh yeah, that's right. I almost forgot. Bad conditions in the forest cause old trees and brush filling in. And that's since 1910, when there was a particularly bad forest fire, and they said, the Forest Service, you got to stop any fire forever, which was contrary to what the native peoples in Australia, America, Africa, they'd always have little fires in the wet periods of the year to try to keep major fires from happening later. Without that, everything, all the trees grow, they keep crowding together, they're sick, crammed together. Those cram trees are a tinderbox. You have big fires, and more people are in the American woods. Brush clearance, pretty lax. That's the result. Those fires burn so big, they make their own fire nados. When that happens, the winds blow super hot and hard, and that even burns some of the soil. So it reduces even more carbon dioxide. So you must live with some fires, or else you're going to have mega fires. And between warming, like West Nebraska, wet to desert, and a milder thing, the 1300s, the Pueblo dwelling Anasazi in Colorado, they they had droughts as much as 13 years at a time. So we could have much drier, much hotter. Yeah, global warming, roll of dice, even warmer than that. So that's the threats to from land question discussion. Meanwhile, if you get hold your questions for a second more, I'll see if we've got any other people that are trying to get in. I got to close this down for a second. And more. Do we have any more? I don't see any more. That's all right. Okay. Well, I guess this would be a good time. So anybody else, anybody have any questions? Looks like Kathy, you're muted. You can unmute.
I thought that the ranches and cattle and stuff like that caused more bad stuff than agriculture. Is that?
That's a good point. That's a detail I didn't get into because of time.
Oh,
The
okay.
Another thing the cattle did was ordinarily when there were natural fires of one sort or another, or the burns that the native people did, the grass would carry the fires along to get it to a wider area. Well, when ranchers first showed up and grazed the cattle into the woods, then that cut down the small fires moving along. And so the trees built up, and that contributed to mega fires as well. So yes, cattle grazing is another thing that can contribute to allowing. It's the buildup of brush and super large trees. If you have fewer trees and burn that lower brush and things to get rid of it periodically, you're in better shape. And it's the cattle were one of the things that prevented that. And the railroads and some of the roads did it some more. And then worst of all, the fire service, obeying the orders from Congress, they would put out any fire before 10 o'clock. That was the saying. And that was good, except they stopped fires until everything is built up. It used to be 80 to 100 trees per acre. Now it's 300 per acre. And when they burn high. They burn very hot. Okay, any other questions?
I thought the cows also emit some kind of gas.
They also do. That's methane, and it's when they're chewing their cud, it's burping. It's not the other end.
Oh,
They do emit some methane, although compared with cattle in grazing areas, help the grass grow, and that's a whole other thing in agriculture, something called mob grazing, which mimics the natural herds. The herds that would move along, and there were predators like bears and wolves that would be after them. So they would kind of move on to different places because eventually they had to get by. They didn't want to graze it too far down. And along the way, their hooves would make nice little holes for rainwater to go in. And they would spread their manure around. And over time, the grassland soil built up 10, 20, 50, 100 feet deep of soil in some places versus most areas where it was a foot or something. there's really great grass that the prairies have. And like one subversive thought said, all these grazing animals like the bison and the woolly mammoths in the north, they contributed to so much oxygen being pulled down that that might have been part of what made the last ice age. That's just a theory.
Oh,
Anyway, going back to ordinary agriculture, cattle would be put in one pasture, and of course they'd hang out by the salt block and the water tank, and everything around it would be grazed down to nothing. And so then when the wind came up, then you have a bunch of dust. So it was really, really bad. So mob grazing is you have the cattle in for a little while and they're just chewing along, and then they get moved to another pasture. So they're in a hurry to do it. They pulled up a bunch of grass, but then it gets several weeks to recover. And so the grass is much better that way. And again, you're building up soil. So you're pulling down a lot of carbon dioxide into carbon in the soil, which makes better soil and hopefully will more than balance any of the greenhouse warming for methane. And also the good news about methane is it's much more volatile than carbon dioxide. It'll be gone in a couple, 3 years, whereas carbon dioxide could last 80 or 100 years. A lot more stable thing. And Sharon.
Yeah, I also thought that the pigs, the waste from the pigs, they collected in bins, huge bins, and that's a real cause of methane.
Yes, and hopefully, yeah, it's better that you find some way to spread it out on the land and let it become part of the soil. Or even a number of places, they have bins where they put pig manure or cattle manure in, and then the methane produced is actually gathered and used. And that's been done all over the world back and forth. The worst of all things is big pits where, like on the East Coast, occasionally there'd be a hurricane and these pits with pig manure gets washed out to sea, and then you have terrible blooms.
That's what I saw.
Yeah,
Something caused these big swaths of pig manure to leak out into streams and every place else.
yeah, the red algae. As with anything else, if you got too much manure in some place and it's not being recycled into nature, terrible things start happening, from typhus and other diseases to the red tide, the hysteria. It's a poisonous kind of algae with the red tides.
Yeah.
And I guess that's a good conclusion with the awful scary thing of the red tide, which appears in the book of Revelations, that the sea turned red and all the things in the sea died. By golly, that person knew some marine biology.
oh,
Well, we have the red tide here too.
Yeah,
Tide in the summertime, like in September, we have a red tide, and the fish die out. You know, it's smelly, but it's beautiful phosphorescent, because when the waves break, the waves are phosphorescent.
yeah, with them too. But
it's really quite pretty.
yeah, they say the East Coast is worse because Pacific has a lot more open water to dilute things.
Oh yeah.
Anyway, now I'll get back to Ted. Talked about all the problems. We'll see if we can start curing the problems. Solutions. The best start with this is where I saw a book that was called Feeding Everyone No Matter What, Managing Food Security After Global Catastrophe. And these two fellows, Denkenberger and Pierce, went through a number of scenarios of volcanic mega eruption or a nuclear war causing cooling, or a sudden heating. And it's like, what would we do in this case? And what would we do in that place? And they found ways to deal with it. So that gave me a bunch of ideas. And I'm going to start with the dozen fixes, starting with better agriculture. So plowing was one of the big problems with the Dust Bowl. And lo and behold, in the last 30 years, what if they gave a revolution and nobody noticed? Plows have almost entirely disappeared. They have these big roller wheels that crush the plants that are on the surface, and then the farmers can go back and drill in to plant. The crushers have killed the plants on the surface, so they plant new plants in between there, but there's still plants on the surface for insulation, for holding water in, and so it grows much better. And then another way is to simply keep crop residue on the land instead of cleaning the cornfields off, so all you see is dirt and the little stubs of plants. Okay, that stuff can stay there, and along the way, something goes back to Roman times, and sure before, is you can intercrop them, or polyculture, where you put trees together in one place, and then you might graze cattle amongst trees, and you might have have like wheat in one place, and maybe some vines a little higher on the edge. The Romans did well with that. And likewise, as I mentioned, mob grazing, keeping the cattle moving around, so all the land is chewed, but not too much, so the grass can come back. Second, everything is coming with the next robot revolution. And that comment is like from one of the comedians, Steve Martin, who had a monologue about, let's all get small, like a new drug to get small. Robots can make things small. The trend of tractors and combines, these giant things. And one of the people who had a book about this said, we get to a point where we have a 120-foot wide sprayer going across the field. Well, that's just one thing with one operator because we're short of operators. But if you had robots, instead of 120 feet wide one machine, you could have 120 little machines robotically going across their way. And that you get really fancy, some of these things could be like a shop vac, sucking up aphids or potato bugs. And they could also do the clipping and whatnot to make these intercropping much more practical. And you can use it in some ways that I'll get to. Next thing, this is relatively non-robotic, but it has some robotic things in. This is a battery powered, it's a lithium battery that we've been hearing about. Solar cells on the surface. You control direction and speed with the foot pedals. And this guy in here is picking strawberries, I believe. You could do a bunch of things. You could also replace a short hoe with something like this. You're not bending over and doing things. And one person could probably replace several or something like that. Yeah. Anyway, this is the RoboHand 2 picking assistant. And that's something being sold on the East Coast, and one person in California bought it. I think some more will be buying it shortly. Yeah. Along the way, the third thing, more variety. We only use about 200 plants to any great extent, but 300,000 are really edible. And I could start with potatoes, which in passing, in the story, potatoes were originally developed in Peru, where they were poisonous. And the hardworking peasants up in the Andes did some breeding and probably had some casualties along the way, made potato a major foodstuff. Came back to America, they only thought of feeding it to animals. A fellow named Parmentier gave a potato blossom to the Queen of France. Potatoes are now a big French thing. Many of the recipes with the name Parmentier built into the name. United States, Robert Gibb, this fella put a note up on a certain date. He said, I will eat this type of vegetable at noon on that date. He showed up, and sure enough, along with the crowd, walked up on the steps, and he took a big bite of a tomato and did not die. So going for the future, from Peru, quinoa is a type of grain that's high protein. They're trying to make that a new mainstream crop. Hopefully they succeed. If it gets warmer, tropical plants in the USA if needed. Hey, we might be able to grow our own bananas and our own coffee. You never know. If life gives you global warming, make coffee. Some other possibilities: hemp, made illegal for various reasons, besides being edible, and I'm not talking about the drug version. This is just a plant that isn't psychoactive. CBD is something that's been used as a pain reliever. You can make cloth, you can make paper out of hemp as well. Water lilies, it's a vegetable. You can also make more cloth, make more paper. Kanaf, or elephant grass, it's, of course, came from Africa, as you might expect. Also a major crop in Brazil. Can grow in Florida and Texas. You can make paper. You can even process some of the material chemicals from that into plastic. And biochar, which you'll hear about later. Bamboo, another one that actually can grow here. And another revolution that's coming is wood. Bamboo, technically not wood, but it looks like wood, and it can work with wood. And again, you can cook it up and make plastic out of it. Now, better plants. The Green Revolution was all about wheat that was shorter and more productive and could resist a fungus called the rust blight. And then from that, people in Asia saw what was done with wheat, and they did it with rice. That Green Revolution prevented the great famines that were predicted in the 1970s. Well, a lot of plants are getting better with that. And there's something I call the 10-foot moonshot, because a number of people said, oh, if we just had something exciting, like going to the moon. Well, there could be something exciting. Down in La Jolla, the research institute down there, the Salk Institute, is breeding plants that would have larger roots that go deeper into the ground. And even better, those roots would have essentially natural cork in them, suberin. So with those roots going down, the plants can pull water from deeper, so they could resist heat and drought that might happen if this global warming thing becomes serious. And even after the plant dies, that cork lasts for decades and possibly centuries. So that is another way to pull carbon dioxide down from the atmosphere to decrease carbon dioxide levels. And 8 more to go, so I'm going fast. Along the way, we could eat more vegetables. It is a little healthier, but we still should keep some meat, because some land is only good for grazing. So it keeps us in a production of food in case things get tight, and it helps build soil with more carbon in it, pulls down, that's more fertile soil, and it pulls carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And the wild thing where farmers might need to find some other products is there's a lot of vegetarian fake meats out there, wham and cheese, impossible burgers, veggie chili. Yeah, some of those things are tasty. So far, they're a little bit more expensive than real meat, or at least on the hamburger sides. On steaks, they might be competing pretty soon. Now, fungi is something that fungi, but hey, fungi is some of the tastiest things around. Cheese, yogurt, mushrooms, miso, sauerkraut, if you're from North Europe. And of course, what would we do without wine? We'd have to invent it. So a lot of things can come with fungi. We could get a lot more, maybe 20 times more high protein food per acre than livestock. And you can grow it on waste material from other things. If you're multi-cropping, or you have cover crops, what they call which is to keep something growing on the land so it doesn't erode. But what do you do with that extra grass or straw, little things you can get? You can grow mushrooms with it. And something else, fungi can also, certain kinds can make chitin, which presently comes from shells from shrimp and from lobsters. And when chitin is mixed with wood, it can be re-engineered to make a very termite resistant material, something I've come to really appreciate in California. This re-engineered wood is something that's like redwood. It resists all kinds of dry rot and pests. And if you're really going to do it big time, you need some source of fungi that could come, or a fungi source of chitin, which could come from mushrooms. Another crop in case the prices drop too low. And along the way, another use for small amounts of extra leaves and whatnot, plants, what they call mini livestock. Of course, we know about chickens, but you can have something as small as crickets, grasshoppers, snails, escargot. There's a number of plants and insects and whatnot. They can grow in a small area. They grow small, fast. They're cold-blooded, so very little food energy is wasted keeping temperature up. If people don't want to eat them, they're good protein supplement for the livestock. There we go. And here's my favorite. Clint Eastwood before he became famous there. There's oases have been around for a long time, and in the Garden of Versailles, there's a large building called the Orangiere, which has a lot of big windows and it has some huge doors. In the summer, the King of France's orange trees were there in big pots. And these pots are on big wheels. So when it gets close to cooler part of fall, the big pots are moved inside. So the king's oranges could stay good for the next year. So since then, greenhouses have gotten cheaper. There's been, well, again, those robotic controls, thermostats and whatnot to check temperatures, plastics, which are a much cheaper way to get to keep everything sealed off and still get sunlight in. In fact, there's an area called the Sea of Plastic on the coast of Spain, and that area provides a good portion of the fresh vegetables for Europe because people are growing in their greenhouses. A fancier way is you can grow multi-story sorts of things, and that's vertical farms. Of course, in that case, you don't have the sun except on the top layer, and the lower layers spend money not for land, but for the electricity to get their light. An exotic new technology coming is something called radiative cooling. So if you have just an ordinary greenhouse, say in Southern California or Arizona or New Mexico, when it's very hot, the radiative cooling is a certain material that will radiate infrared in a wavelength that goes through the greenhouse effect. So it can send heat out into space and keep the plants cool, or sufficiently cool for the summer. Earth shelter structures is an ancient thing, but it works. Say at the north side of your greenhouse, you have a place that has tons and tons of dirt or rock, and that may keep your greenhouse area cool by 10 or 15 degrees in the summer. It's an old idea, which is used, should be used a lot more. Agrivoltaics, here's a nice thing. It's been being researched more and more. You combine solar panels and plants. The solar panels aren't quite as efficient because they're spread out a little more. The plants don't produce quite as much. But the, say, 3/4 electricity and 3/4 plants gets essentially 1.5 times the productivity of what the land would have been. And in some places, especially if it's hotter and drier, which has been predicted, that might keep us producing even in that hotter climate. And there it is, interspersing solar panels with crops. It uses less water, less heat on the plants. And surprisingly, it even makes the solar panels more efficient because they're a little bit cooler because of the cool ground. Bottom line, cash crops are cash crops, whether almonds, grapes, or electrons. Now, finally, we get back to the forest. We should have mega fires going to mega products. And the prediction is that between our bad forestry practices and hotter and drier climates coming, we're going to have huge fires. So the thought is lay out a bunch of firebreak strips through in areas of federal land, which is in some areas half or more of the land, of the forest land in California, Oregon, Washington, Montana, Wyoming, New Mexico. So those things may be 1/4 mile wide. Those would be places to really slow down fires. And hopefully, even if you've got a fire, it'd be a mega fire that would stop there. Then over time, these are areas that would have an industry that would support a return to lumbering to pay for some of these strips and pay for escape roads for people getting out of fires. Lumbering could go through and thin the lumber on each side. And that goes back to having some use for what was wood waste. When I was young, there were things called teepee burners in Montana, Wyoming, and Northern California. Much of the year, there was a green or a white gray smoke that would cover everything because the teepee burners burned off waste sawdust. There are smaller heaters now that the Forest Service has invented. They can go out, they can cook that material. You can get chemicals out there called biorefineries. And that can make plastic. It could even make fuel, which would be carbon neutral because it comes from carbon dioxide was pulled down by the trees and you get it. And if you don't have any plastic or better wood products, a major sales item, by the way, for the tree farmers, worst comes to worst, you still have, in fact, even in the best of times, you want to make some biochar. And that is, the story comes from the Amazon 500 years ago, as the conquistadores were first arriving. There were millions of people there. And one of the things they did was they would make a soft charcoal, mix it with any other organic waste, and put it in the ground. That made the soil very fertile. This soft charcoal or biochar would hold minerals, even with the terrible hard rains and heat that you get in that tropical area. So whereas many of the soils in that area have leached out to be this red, laterite, almost a wasteland thing, the areas of Amazon Indian black earth are still fertile to this day, 500 years later. And if you're thinning out extra brush from the forest on either side, what isn't good trees for lumber can be all these things, plastics, fuel, and a certain amount of biochar to go back into the ground to maintain carbon storage. This is carbon sequestration to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide going into the air, cut down on the possibility of warming. So after all the soily, dirty dozen, final comment is that some combination of these things probably can provide certainly all the food we need, cut down on global warming, perhaps bring it to a stop. And there's a lot of other ideas that I haven't even heard about. You just need to work on doing those things. Now, questions?
Okay, hi Roger, it's Ceci.
Yes,
This was
Ceci.
this is so educational. Thank you for pulling this together. I had a question about I find it all very fascinating, but I had a question about the greenhouses. Like if, for example, you had access or you purchased whatever a lot of land up north, and you definitely needed a greenhouse to have, to grow a whole bunch of crops, or if you wanted to go into a project where you did a co-op and you just had, 365 days a year, you're growing food. My question, because I am very uneducated in this topic, is how would you make the soil like fertile to grow all these things? Would you have to use like a mixture of biochar? Like how could it replicate what like nature does in an environment like a greenhouse?
Actually, in many areas that are cold, there is good soil. It's just lacking in warmth. So if you had poor soil, then you do the usual things of finding organic matter and composting and adding fertilizer. So it's
then that could work to help kind of like grow the crops. And then I did have like a backup question. Like if you did that, right, then ideally you would be distributing the food that you did in that region, that, locally, like within the next like the next few states or whatever. I just kind of I wonder, like if people did projects like this throughout the country, it would kind of work. But would it work if like somebody was shipping out food that they made in like Massachusetts to like North Dakota, or is that like not as great because because of the carbon footprint?
It's and this has been talked about a lot. The locavore movement. That's it. They want there's carnivores who eat meat, herbivores eat vegetables, and locavores want to eat local things. And they say
Right.
It'll be so much less carbon dioxide produced to eat locally, but they're pretty efficient moving stuff in. So the people that want to do local, they frequently grown the really fancier, more expensive things. Like it's called microgreens is one of the things that they do, and it's kind of like sprouts, only they grow a little bit further, and then that's cut off, and you can sell that, and it's more expensive, but you have it right there, so you don't have to ship it, and so there you're doing the competition. Likewise, you can also have, I didn't mention aquaponics, and you could have fish growing under a layer, like vegetarian fishes like tilapia in particular. And again, if you sell it right there, you've beat the transportation costs, even though somebody in South America might have the people work cheap and they've got a lot of warm sunshine and they got some big areas of land. And so they produce really efficiently. So it's an ongoing competition, and hopefully cheaper LEDs, more development of LEDs to keep the vertical farms, getting them more competitive. But it's an ongoing thing of competition between local and distant production.
Roger.
Yes, Chuck.
Um, you haven't touched on this, and I don't know if it's appropriate or not, but by some estimations, 30 or 40% of the food produced in this country is ultimately wasted, thrown away because of lack of, it exceeds expiration dates. All the energy that goes into producing it and transporting it and distributing it is for naught. Is there any do you have any ideas on how we might cut down on this waste?
Actually, yeah, I didn't get to it, but the idea of when you have your mini livestock, your crickets and soldier fly larvae, and of course chickens and things can use some of that waste. You can have, this is, if you can't find any other use for it, a biorefinery can turn a lot of it to plastics or fuel, and failing that, you make it into biochar, which is a lot more compact for taking it back out to the land and building up soil fertility.
Sure.
So that's the best thing you can do. And then, of course, there's other things about food banks and whatnot for, hey, if this is still good, tasty food, can we get it to somebody that really needs it? But that's another issue.
Well, anything rather than throw it into the landfill without processing it and making the best use of it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So landfills is another webinar. That's coming. Stay tuned.
Roger.
Yeah, Sharon.
To go on further with what Chuck was saying, they have these imperfect foods that they're selling now. You know how they have, it doesn't look really great,
Mhm.
but it's
Oh,
totally
yeah.
edible,
Seconds.
and they've been throwing that away, and
Mhm.
now they're starting to use it for a lot of things.
Mhm.
Because when a market has it, maybe it's like you were saying, you know, it's not quite perfect. It's a little beyond its perfection date, but it's totally edible. And
Yeah.
so you're using that a lot now, or they're
Mhm.
starting to, and I think that's a good thing to do.
Yeah.
I also wanted to talk about insects. I know years and years ago at near the Santa Monica airport, went out to lunch with some girls, and one of the things on the menu was insects. And so I ordered several different a variety of different insects. And
You're very brave.
they
Good
were
for you.
they were delicious. They served it on a lettuce leaf, and then they had the insects that were deep, you know, deep fried. So you know they're just crispy. It was nothing but it was crispy, but they had a lot of really good tasting ingredients in it. And it was really lovely. And I'm going, you know, we certainly have a lot of insects,
Mhm.
not so much in Southern California, but we certainly do other places. And that could be another, it's has a lot of nutrients in it. So
Mhm.
that's another thing.
Yes, most definitely. A good part of the world, people have various insect delicacies.
Yeah.
And the Europeans and their descendants in North America tend to be rather squeamish. On the other hand, the French invented escargot of snails.
Yeah.
Lobsters are often referred to as the cockroaches of the sea. King king crabs look to me an awful lot like daddy long legs spiders. And as you said, there's a lot of high protein food there.
Years ago, they used to feed the prisoners the lobsters, and but they'd love to have that now because that's a real treat.
Yes. Yeah, I knew somebody from Boston. He said before World War II, lobster was cheap in Boston. And then after the war, when aviation got better, then they could fly lobsters all over the country. And so then it became expensive in Boston as well
Mm.
as everywhere else.
Yeah.
It's that locavore thing again versus the local production versus better transportation.
Right. Right.
Okay, any other questions? Okay.
I had one.
Oh, yes,
Did
okay.
you say, well, you wanted to say what we can do and stuff? Is one of the solutions that we all have our own garden?
That's a lot of people have said, hey, go back to uh, the comment is that lawns are equivalent of maybe about the state of Kentucky. So the production of food that could come from lawns, you can keep your front lawns and use your back lawns for victory gardens and whatnot, and you get some very fresh vegetables. I've never tasted a tomato as good as what I could grow in my backyard
Right.
when I had a
Okay.
backyard.
Yeah.
Well, I grow blueberries and other vegetables and some fruits. So
Oh, that's right. Yeah, you're up in a canyon sort of area, so you've got blueberries, you say?
yeah, blueberries.
Hmm, yum.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm your new BFF. Come visit. Probably the fall, right?
No, they're ripening right now.
All right.
Yeah.
Hey, got to arrange something there. Anyway, I think we're just on time. Unless, well, maybe. Okay. Yeah, and it's my turn to thank you for spending the time for doing this and having comments because, like I said, you get information from people. For instance, I talked about these fire breaks, and somebody said, "What about the animals?" And I said, "Oh yeah, you'd have to have some open space where animals like the coyotes and possums and raccoons or whatever they could get from one area of forest to another. And plants might take some foresters to get them moved,
Hmm.
but the animals certainly they have no problems. Coyotes definitely don't. They live they're in the mountains all the way down to my backyard.
Yeah. True.
Okay. And gee, that speaking of trees and things, that looks particularly good behind you, Kathy. You for some reason you popped up uh, as a center picture.
Oh,
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, thanks everybody for calling and see if we were in the same place instead of in separate cities and states. We'd go out and have some lunch.
Well, thanks, Roger. I'm going to take off. It's a little past my bedtime, but
Yeah.
it's been very interesting. Thank you for doing
Okay.
it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank-
Glad you managed to make it through.
See you,
And the
everybody.
guided meditation will be great. I'm sure it will. And I've been having a great time with it.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It was amazing, incredible. You're so smart, and this is great solutions to just the world we live in. It gets your mind thinking about
Mhm.
all the possibilities. So I can't stop thinking about it now. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Have a good night.
I love it. I love it. You too.
Bye.
All right.
Yeah. Good night. Yeah,
Okay.
good night, all.
Thank you, Roger.
Mhm.
These are important topics.
Yeah. Come to
Really
think about it, are we hope it won't be quite as important as some people fear, but it might be.
Well, we have to prepare for it in case.
Hmm. This is true.
Yeah.
Okay.
Nice.
But a few blueberries will make us, we'll get through on that. Blueberries. Yeah. Okay. Good night.
Good night.